Hey friends, welcome back. I'm Forgotten Scrolls, and today we're diving into one of history's greatest mysteries, the lost city of Atlantis. Was it just a legend, or could Plato's writings actually be a blueprint of a real civilization? Stick around because we're about to explore the most fascinating theories behind this ancient enigma. Plato gave us Atlantis in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, and that's all we've got from ancient times. No other Greek or Roman writer mentioned it before him, and most didn't bother with it after. He describes a massive island, empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, bigger than Libya and Asia put together. Its capital had those famous rings, 3 circles of water and 2 of land, like a giant bullseye in the ocean. At the center stood a temple to Poseidon covered in silver, with a gold statue so big its head scraped the ceiling. This wasn't some primitive village. Plato says they had hot and cold running water, an organized military, and enough wealth to build palaces from red, white, and black stone. Their docks were packed with triremes, and they'd allegedly conquered parts of Europe and Africa before. Athens stopped them. Then, in one bad day, around 9600 BCE, earthquakes and floods sank the whole thing. The seas swallowed every building, every ship, even the land itself. Here's the first problem. Plato wrote this around 360 BCE, putting Atlantis' destruction nearly 9,200 years before his own time. That's like me telling you about a high-tech civilization from 7200 BCE with perfect details. The guy's clearly working with unreliable sources. Worse, he sets up the story in Timaeus by calling it a tale, though strange. Is certainly true, which sounds a lot like someone saying this actually happened. No, really, right before lying to you. Scholars split into 2 camps. One side thinks Plato made it up as an allegory about hubris, the Atlantis story. Immediately follows his description of the ideal state in the Republic. The other side clutches onto his oddly specific details. The precise measurements of the rings, the exact materials in the temple, even the names of Atlantis kings. No one writes fake tax records for an imaginary city, unless they're up to something. The destruction sequence matches other Greek myths too perfectly. Poseidon's anger, the divine punishment. It's the same story as Troy or Sodom with better architecture. But Plato's never been shy about tweaking real places for philosophical lessons. He famously altered Athens' geography in Critias to fit his moral about virtuous cities. So when he gives Atlantis a precise location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, you've got to wonder if he's dangling a fake treasure map. Yet that treasure map launched 1,000 expeditions. Every detail became a clue, the rings, the metals, the timeline. Some Renaissance maps literally marked where Atlantis should be. Modern archaeologists groan about this, pointing out that Plato was probably just illustrating how even great nations fall. But try telling that to the guy with the sonar equipment scanning off the coast of Spain right now, the real kicker. The dialogue's cut off mid-sentence during a speech by Zeus. Plato never finished the story, leaving Atlantis frozen in that moment before destruction. Unresolved, unproven, a cliffhanger that's had us guessing for 2,400 years. Asterisk the island now. Called Santorini used to be a single circular landmass until about 1600 BCE, then its volcano exploded with the force of several atomic bombs. This wasn't just any eruption. It was one of the largest volcanic events in recorded history, punching a hole in the Mediterranean where the center of the island used to be. The explosion sent tsunamis racing toward Crete, just 70 miles south. Where the Minoans had built Europe's first advanced civilization, the Minoans had everything Plato described about Atlantis. Their palaces at Knossos had multi-story buildings, flush toilets, and sophisticated drainage systems, plumbing, more advanced than anything else in Europe for another 2,000 years. They painted elaborate frescoes of dolphins and bull leaping ceremonies across their walls. Their ships dominated Mediterranean trade routes, bringing in Egyptian gold and Cypriot copper, and geologists say. Those tsunamis from Santorini's eruption wiped out their ports and coastal towns in minutes. Here's where it gets messy. Plato said Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, typically understood as the Strait of Gibraltar. Santorini sits inside the Mediterranean, nowhere near Gibraltar. The Minoan civilization also collapsed gradually over decades after the eruption, not in a single catastrophic day. And Plato's date of 9600 BCE is off by about 8,000 years from when Santorini blew up. But tsunamis leave an impression. Imagine waves tall enough to swallow entire islands hitting Crete's northern coast. The water would have rushed miles inland, dragging ships back out to sea when it retreated. Fishermen would have vanished mid-cast. Coastal settlements became driftwood. For survivors watching from hills, it must have looked like the ocean itself was attacking. That imagery matches Plato's description of earthquakes, followed by floods that made Atlantis vanish beneath the sea. Oral histories about the disaster could have survived for centuries before being reshaped into the Atlantis story. Archaeologists found pumice from Santorini's eruption in Egyptian tombs. Proof the catastrophe was noted across the Mediterranean. The Minoan theory gained traction because it ticks so many boxes. Advanced civilization? Check. Sudden marine disaster? Check. Circular island shape. Santorini's caldera forms a near-perfect ring. Even the Minoan bull imagery parallels Plato's mention of Atlantis sacrificing bulls. Skeptics point out that no known Minoan ruins match Atlantis's concentric rings. Their cities were rectangular, not circular. And Plato never mentions ash, which would have blanketed the region after the eruption. But disasters get mythologized quickly. Think of how flood stories appear in cultures worldwide with differing details. Modern excavations at Acroteria, Minoan town preserved under Santorini's ash, reveal snapshots of that last day. Unfinished meals still sit on tables. Storage jars stand where workers left them. The absence of skeletons suggests people had time to flee, perhaps receiving warnings from earthquakes before the main eruption. If this was Atlantis's inspiration, Plato or his sources dramatically altered the facts. The location moved west. The timeline stretched back, the details embellished, but the core remains. An advanced sea power destroyed by nature's fury. The Minoan theory works because it takes Plato's fantasy and anchors it to physical evidence. We can touch the pumice, the ruins, the tsunami debris layers still visible in coastal cliffs. Of all Atlantis candidates, this one has archaeologists nodding grudgingly. No, they say, it's not the literal Atlantis, but as inspiration. That story checks out. The best lies contain truth, and what's more plausible than survivors exaggerating the greatest disaster their world had ever seen? In 1882, a Minnesota politician named Ignatius Donnelly self-published a book that would change how people imagined Atlantis forever. Atlantis. The antediluvian world took Plato's story and stretched it across the entire globe. Donnelly wasn't just looking for a lost city. He wanted a lost supercontinent right where the Atlantic Ocean is today. His Atlantis wasn't merely advanced, but the mother civilization that spawned all others. He claimed Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mayan pyramids, and even the alphabet itself all came from this drowned world. Donnelly's evidence relied on cultural similarities that modern anthropologists would call coincidences at best. He noted that both sides of the Atlantic had flood myths, pyramid builders, and sun worship. His big finish? Sweet potatoes. The fact that South America and Polynesia both grew them proved to Donnelly that Atlanteans must have spread the plant before their continent sank. Never mind that sweet potatoes float and could have drifted across oceans naturally. The book became a sensation because it arrived at the perfect moment. Charles Darwin had published on the origin of species just 23 years earlier, and people were obsessed with origins of humans, of cultures, of everything. Donnelly gave readers a simple answer. Everything came from Atlantis. His timing coincided with the golden age of spiritualism, when wealthy Victorians held seances to contact the dead. Atlantis became the ultimate ghost story, an entire civilization waiting to speak through the right medium. Modern oceanography laughs at Donnelly's map. Sonar surveys show the Atlantic floor is basaltic crust, not the granite you'd expect from a sunken continent. The mid-Atlantic ridge, which Donnelly thought was part of Atlantis's mountain range, is actually a volcanic rift where new seafloor forms. Plate tectonics confirms continents can't just sink like boats. They're too buoyant. Even if you drained the Atlantic to find Atlantis, you'd just see undersea mountains stretching between the Americas and Africa, not a single submerged empire. Yet, Donnelly's legacy persists in every pseudo-scientific Atlantis theory that followed. He established the template: take Plato's details, ignore inconvenient facts, and claim all ancient cultures secretly point to one glorified progenitor. His book directly inspired Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy movement, Nazi occultists hunting for Aryan roots, and even the modern ancient astronauts crowd can draw a straight line from Donnelly's Atlantis to the History Channel's aliens built the pyramids nonsense. The book's lasting power comes from how it repackaged Plato. Where the Greek philosopher told a moral fable about hubris, Donnelly sold technological nostalgia. His Atlantis had airships, death rays, and energy crystals, essentially a steampunk utopia. This vision still fuels video games and Hollywood scripts today. James Cameron's Atlanteans and Avatar, The Way of Water, are basically Donnelly's wet dream with blue skin. Most damningly, Donnelly cherry-picked Plato while ignoring crucial context. He seized on the concentric circles but skipped the part where Creus admits the story might be an invented fable. He used the 9600 BCE date, but ignored that Greek historians considered anything before 2000 BCE unreliable myth. Modern archaeologists cringe at how Donnelly treated Plato's text like a Google Maps pin drop rather than philosophical allegory. Still, you've got to admire the hustle. The man was a failed congressman who reinvented himself as an ancient history guru. He wrote the book in his spare time while serving as Minnesota's lieutenant governor, poring over books in the state library. The first printing sold out immediately. Despite being 400 pages of dense arguments about crop rotation patterns in ancient Mesopotamia, I'll say what you will about his theories. The guy could make geology page-turn. Today we know cultures develop independently through trade and migration, not from some blueprint handed down by Atlantean refugees. But Donnelly's real success wasn't proving. Plato right, it was proving we'll always crave a single magical explanation for human progress. His Atlantis became a Rorschach test where believers see whatever they want. Nazis saw Aryans, New Agers. See crystal healers and archaeologists see a warning about confirmation bias. The kicker? Even Donnelly hedged his bets. In later editions, he admitted parts of his theory were probable conjecture rather than absolute demonstration. But by then the myth had outgrown him. What started as one man's obsessive thesis became the shared fantasy of generations. The original conspiracy theory about history's greatest conspiracy, asterisk. The 1970s took Atlantis from philosophy books to airport paperbacks thanks to Charles Berlitz. His family made money teaching languages, but he found his fortune selling mysteries. His book claimed Atlantis didn't just sink, it sank right where planes and ships kept disappearing in the Bermuda Triangle. Two unsolved puzzles for the price of one. Never mind that Plato placed Atlantis near Gibraltar, almost 2,000 miles from the Bahamas. When details don't fit, just move the lost city. Divers off Bimini Island had found strange underwater formations years earlier, lines of rectangular rocks that looked suspiciously like pavement. The so-called Bimini Road became Atlantis's driveway overnight. Never mind that the stones were uneven, lacked mortar, and didn't connect to anything resembling a city. True believers saw what they wanted: proof that a harbor or temple complex lurked beneath the waves. Archaeologists who pointed out these were naturally fractured beach rock got shouted down. The rocks fit the fantasy too perfectly to question. Plato mentioned harbors. Here were some rocks underwater. Case closed. Geologists later showed these formations occurred naturally when coastal limestone fractures along weak points, creating straight lines. The same process makes hexagonal basalt columns like the Giant's Causeway. But by then, the myth had momentum. Berlitz doubled down, insisting scientists were covering up the truth. His books mixed real disappearances like Flight 19 with wild speculation about Atlantean energy crystals interfering with compasses. The more authorities dismissed him, the more fans he gained. This became the blueprint for modern conspiracy theories. Claim experts are hiding something, then sell books to the skeptics. The Bermuda Triangle connection stuck because it answered nothing while suggesting everything. Why did ships vanish? Atlantis. Why did compasses malfunction? Atlantis. Never mind that Lloyd's of London showed the area had no more disappearances than other busy shipping lanes, or that most mysteries had mundane explanations, sudden storms, human error, mechanical failure. The idea of some ancient force lingering beneath the waves was too enticing. It turned random tragedies into pieces of a grand puzzle. Modern. Sonar mapping shows nothing but flat ocean floor around Bimini. No pillars, no crumbled walls, just sand and the occasional shipwreck. But that's dull compared to the alternative. The Bermuda Triangle theory survives because it's fun, the ultimate what if. It lets you imagine piloting a plane. When suddenly the instruments go haywire and through the clouds, you glimpse stone towers breaking the surface. Never mind that water pressure would crush any structure at those depths within centuries. The image sticks because it's cinematic. Berlitz knew his audience. He didn't write for scholars, but for people who wanted to believe. His books sit comfortably between fact and fiction, peppering real historical events with wild leaps. He'd cite a 19th century ship disappearance, then suggest Atlantean survivors shot it down with ray guns. Readers ate it up because the truth is boring. A merchant ship sinks in a storm, standard maritime tragedy. A merchant ship swallowed by an ancient death ray from the deep. That's a paperback bestseller. The real legacy here isn't about Atlantis. It's about how myths evolve. Berlitz took Plato's morality tale and strapped it to a modern myth about technology gone wrong. His Atlantis wasn't just a drowned city, but a cautionary tale about hubris, like Greek myth, remixed for the atomic age. The stones at Bimini turned out to be just stones, but the story they inspired reveals something else entirely. How easily we'll ignore facts for a good yarn. Today you can still book Atlantis tours in the Bahamas where guides will show you the ruins. The rocks haven't changed, still fragmented, still naturally formed. But squint a little, let the sun hit the water just right, and you can almost pretend. That's why this theory outlasts all the others. It lets you feel like an explorer discovering clues everyone else missed. Never mind that geologists mapped every inch of that seafloor decades ago. Venture isn't in what's there, but in what you imagine might be. Asterisk. In 1958, a college professor named Charles Hapgood suggested something even wilder than Atlantis sinking. He said it might have slipped. His book Earth's Shifting Crust argued that around 12,000 years ago, our planet did a sudden pole shift, sending continents sliding across the globe like cups on a wet table. Antarctica, he claimed, wasn't always at the South Pole. It drifted there from warmer latitudes, flash freezing whatever civilization had been living there. Think of it as the world's worst case of real estate depreciation. Hapgood got an unexpected boost when Albert Einstein wrote the foreword to his book. The physicist didn't exactly endorse the Atlantis stuff, but he agreed some crust displacement seemed possible based on polar ice accumulation. That small nod from science's biggest name gave the theory just enough credibility to stick around. Never mind that Einstein died before plate tectonics became widely accepted, proving how continents actually move. That signed forward still gets trotted out by believers today as if it's a Nobel Prize endorsement. Modern geology shows Hapgood's theory doesn't hold up under ice core scrutiny. Continents move approximately as fast as your fingernails grow, about 2 inches per year. For Antarctica to have shifted from habitable to frozen wasteland and human, timescales would require crustal movement thousands of times faster than anything ever observed. Satellite measurements show Antarctica's ice sheet averages a mile thick in most places. If there were ruins under there, they'd be crushed into geological dust under that weight. Yet the frozen Atlantis theory persists because it transforms Plato's morality tale into something grander, a planetary catastrophe. Hapgood's version suggests Earth itself betrayed its inhabitants, not just some angry gods. His crust displacement explanation tied neatly into the Atlantis myth by offering a mechanism for how an entire civilization could vanish abruptly. Earthquakes and floods become side effects of the whole planet doing the geologic equivalent of a pirouette. Radar mapping from modern ice-penetrating surveys shows no signs of buried cities. just layers of compressed snow stretching back 800,000 years. No unnatural right angles appear in the scanned data, no clusters suggesting artificial structures. Warm periods in Antarctica's history did occur, but never within the last several million years when anything resembling human civilization existed. The last time parts of Antarctica were ice-free was during the Eocene, when the closest thing to intelligent life was early primates roughly the size of squirrels. What keeps people hooked is the Piri race map controversy, a 16th-century Ottoman chart allegedly showing Antarctica's coastline before ice covered it. Scholars agree the map probably depicts South America, with cartographic errors common for the period. But that explanation lacks the punch of insisting someone mapped a hidden continent. Never mind that the same map includes mythical creatures and gets distances wildly wrong. True believers focus on vague similarities to subglacial topography we've only mapped in the last century. Hapgood deserves credit for trying to explain real mysteries like why woolly mammoths flash froze with food still in their stomachs. His crustal displacement theory attempted to answer legitimate questions before science had all the pieces. Today we know those mammoths died in regional events like methane explosions during periods of climate change, not global slippage. His idea of continents adrift created an irresistible image, one that turned Atlantis from a drowned city into an entire lost world, the frozen Atlantis. Theory marks where pseudoscience diverges from productive speculation. Hapgood worked before plate tectonics explained continental movement, so his ideas weren't unreasonable for the 1950s. The problem comes when people ignore 60 subsequent years of geological research to cling to his outdated model. Believers add laser weapons and alien alliances to compensate for the lack of physical evidence. It's creating a feedback loop where each new impossibility requires even wilder explanations. At its core, Antarctica's Atlantis represents our fear of forgotten history. The idea that entire civilizations could vanish without leaving traces unsettles us. Never mind that we found evidence of much smaller cultures from far older periods. There's something compelling about imagining an advanced society crushed under miles of ice, waiting to be uncovered during some future melt. The truth might be boring, just shifting tectonic plates and climate cycles, but that doesn't stop us from picturing frozen spires under the glacier fields, asterisk about 7,600 years ago. A wall of seawater broke through what's now the Bosporus Strait with unimaginable force. The Mediterranean had reached a tipping point, spilling over into the freshwater lake we now call the Black Sea. Geologists estimate the water rose at least 6 inches per day, possibly faster. That's like watching the ocean claim your backyard over a single summer. For Neolithic farmers living along those shores, it must have looked like the world was ending. Scientists found the evidence in 1997 when they sampled sediments from the Black Sea floor. Layers of freshwater mollusks abruptly gave way to saltwater species at a specific depth. Carbon dating placed the shift around 5600 BCE. The flood wasn't gradual, it was a violent transition. Freshwater fish would have died in mass as salinity levels spiked. Shoreline villages became underwater ruins within a generation. Imagine your hometown transforming into a shipwreck site during your grandparents' lifetime. Here's where Atlantis enters the picture. The Black Sea flood predates Plato's timeline by nearly 5,000 years. But catastrophic events leave long shadows. Survivors would have fled inland, taking flood stories with them. Those tales could have trickled down through generations, morphing along the way. Most ancient cultures have deluge myths, a Epic of Gilgamesh. The Bible's Noah story, but few involve saltwater overtaking settled land so dramatically. This wasn't just rain, it was the sea itself invading. The Black Sea theory sidesteps Plato's more outlandish details. No advanced technology here, no concentric circles, just farming communities blindsided by rising water. But it explains why his destruction sequence feels so vivid. Earthquakes often precede major floods, as land bridges collapse, matching Plato's description of Atlantis falling in a single dreadful day and night. The Black Sea event even created a current strong enough to drag entire landscapes underwater, which fits the vanished beneath the sea phrasing. Salt water preserves things fresh water destroys. Underwater archaeologist Robert Ballard found shipwrecks in the Black Sea with intact wooden hulls and ropes after 2,500 years. If Neolithic structures existed along the pre-flood shoreline, they might still be down there. But searching is tricky. The sea's anoxic lower layers prevent decay, but also make diving dangerous. Depths beyond 150 meters, even bacteria can't survive. Any potential ruins would be sealed in watery tomb conditions. Critics argue Neolithic. Villagers couldn't have inspired Atlantis because Plato described a bronze-wielding maritime power. But myths conflate eras, constantly think of King Arthur's stories blending medieval knights with Iron Age settings. Oral traditions compress timelines. A catastrophic flood from 5600 BCE might merge with memories of later coastal cities that actually had metal tools. Plato himself may have combined multiple disaster narratives when crafting his allegory. The Black Sea flood reshaped human migration patterns too. DNA studies show agricultural populations suddenly fanning out across Europe around this time, possibly fleeing the rising waters. These displaced groups would have carried their flood trauma westward, where later Greek cultures could have absorbed it. The story morphed over millennia. Small villages became grand cities. Boats became navicine, till Plato codified the legend. What's compelling is how mundane the truth would be compared to the myth. No war with Athens, no divine punishment, just climate change and bad luck. As ice sheets melted after the last ice age, global sea levels rose about 400 feet worldwide. The Black Sea was one of countless coastal areas affected, albeit more dramatically than most. Atlantis's grandeur serves as narrative inflation for what was likely a brutal but unremarkable by geological standards. Flooding event. Modern simulations show the Bosporus breach starting as a trickle before becoming a mile-wide cascade. The sound alone would have carried for Deza constant roar as the Mediterranean carved its new channel. Survivors might have interpreted it as Poseidon's anger, turning a natural process into divine retribution. That psychological shift from environmental accident to moral lesson is how real disasters become. Mythological warnings. If this theory holds, Atlantis wasn't a place, but a process, the collective memory of rising waters swallowing homelands. Across generations, the Black Sea flood offers something rare in Atlantean studies: physical proof that the core disaster could have happened. Not with rings of gold or Atlantean engineers, but with terrified farmers watching the tide claim everything. They knew. Sometimes the truth doesn't need embellishment to be unforgettable. Asterisk. From space, Mauritania's Richat structure looks like someone pressed a giant thumbprint into the Sahara. This natural formation spans nearly 30 miles across, with perfect concentric rings that mirror Plato's description of Atlantis down to the circular waterways. The resemblance is so uncanny that you can't blame people for getting excited. But like seeing Jesus in a piece of toast, sometimes patterns trick our brains into seeing what we want to see. Geologists know exactly how the Eye of Sahara formed. About 100 million years ago, volcanic activity pushed layers of sedimentary rock upward into a dome. Over millennia, erosion carved through different rock types at varying rates. Softer layers wore away faster, leaving behind those distinctive rings. The different colors come from alternating stripes of resistant quartzite and softer volcanic rock. It's essentially nature's version of a layered cake left out in the rain. The Atlantis theory gained traction because Plato's measurements aligned suspiciously well with the Richat's dimensions. His description of alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another, could be a field guide to the structure. Even the location sort of fits Plato, mentions mountains north of Atlantis, and the Richat sits below the Atlas Range. Here's the catch. Plato specifies Atlantis sank underwater. While Mauritania's been dry since dinosaurs roamed, proponents argue the Sahara wasn't always a desert. Satellite imagery shows ancient river channels weaving through the region, proof it had water in prehistoric times. They suggest climate change turned Atlantis into desert rather than ocean. But those rivers dried up thousands of years before any conceivable human civilization. The nearest archaeological finds near the Richat are stone tools from 500,000 years ago, not exactly the gleaming metropolis Plato described in 2018. A YouTube documentary claiming the Richat was Atlantis went viral, sparking renewed interest. The video highlighted the structure's geometry while glossing over inconvenient details like the complete lack of pottery shards, building foundations, or any other signs of habitation. Archaeologists who've studied the area report finding nothing more exciting than fossilized dinosaur bones and scattered Neolithic artifacts. The most damning evidence against the Richat theory comes from its altitude. Plato's Atlantis lay close to the sea, but the ice sits about 1,000 feet above current sea level. Even accounting for lower ocean levels during ice ages, the structure has always been landlocked. There's also no evidence of volcanic activity. Matching Plato's earthquakes, the Richat's geological phenomena happened over millions of years, not in a single catastrophic event. What keeps believers coming back is the sheer perfection of those rings. Visiting the site feels intentionally designed. Walking through each concentric ridge gives the eerie sense of moving through some ancient cities' districts. Nomadic tribes have long considered the site sacred, though their myths describe it as a giant's footprint rather than a lost city. Modern visitors report similar awe, with some claiming to feel energy from the place. Satellite images reveal even more geometric perfection. The rings form near-perfect circles with barely any distortion. Wow. Our brains instinctively reject that. Such symmetry could emerge naturally. But nature loves patterns. Think of honeycombs, spiderwebs, snowflakes. The Richat just happens to be one of Earth's largest natural mounds. The theory persists because swapping Lost Underwater City for Lost Desert City solves key problems with traditional Atlantis locations. No need to explain why no ruins remain underwater. They'd just be buried in sand instead of sea. The Sahara's shifting dunes could theoretically hide anything. But after decades of searching, archaeologists haven't found so much as an Atlantis-themed souvenir shop in the area. Ultimately, the Richat structure shows how desperately we want Atlantis to be real. That perfect circle in the desert taunts us, sits close enough to Plato's description to tease, but just wrong enough to frustrate. Maybe that's why people keep looking. The moment we prove Atlantis isn't there might be more disappointing than never finding it at all. Like a desert mirage, the truth remains always just out of reach. Asterisk, off the coast of Gujarat. India divers keep pulling up stones that shouldn't be there. Perfectly cut rectangular blocks lie scattered across the seafloor about 60 feet underwater, some still stacked like crumbling walls. Local fishermen knew about them for generations. They called the spot the City of Krishna, avoiding it like an underwater graveyard, because according to Hindu texts, that's exactly what it is. The Mahabharata describes Dwarka as Krishna's glittering capital, packed with palaces built on reclaimed land until the gods drowned it as punishment. They say you can still hear temple bells ringing beneath the waves during storms. Archaeologists diving there since the 1980s found more than ghost stories. There's an entire submerged settlement with fortified walls, stone anchors, and pottery shards. Dating to around 1500 BCE, the layout matches descriptions from ancient texts. A planned end city with sectors divided by wide streets, just like Krishna supposedly designed it. Underwater surveys revealed something even more intriguing, evidence of earlier settlements beneath these ruins. It seems people kept rebuilding here as the shoreline shifted, fighting a losing battle against rising waters. Carbon dating places. Dwarka's final collapse around the same time the Harappan civilization was falling apart further north. Both cultures likely faced the same problem, climate change altering monsoon patterns and sea levels. While Plato's Atlantis supposedly sank in a single day, Dwarka's demise was probably slower. The Arabian Sea crept inland gradually, swallowing neighborhoods one by one until residents abandoned the city for good. Over centuries, tides scattered bricks and buried foundations under sediment until only fishermen remembered where it stood. Unlike other Atlantis candidates, Dwarka benefits from having both physical ruins and detailed written accounts. The Mahabharata specifies measurements for Krishna's palace and mentions the city's seawalls. Features archaeologists have identified underwater. One recovered artifact, a stone block with a drilled hole, matches descriptions of ancient Dwarka's drainage system. These parallels make skeptics uneasy. It's one thing to find submerged ruins, but finding ruins that line up with a sacred text feels uncomfortably like proving mythology true. The timeline kills the Atlantis connection, though. Plato's 9600 BCE date puts his lost city thousands of years before Dwarka's existence. Indian historians point out their flood stories predate Greek civilization by centuries, so if anyone borrowed the tale, it might have been Plato. But the real lesson here isn't about who copied who. It's about how coastal societies worldwide recorded their disasters. From Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, civilizations built near water eventually wrote about that water turning against them. Dwarka just happens to have physical evidence to back up the legend. Interestingly, the underwater finds include coral-encrusted stone blocks weighing up to 30 tons. Whoever built here had serious engineering skills, quarried stone transported miles to construct breakwaters against the sea they feared. Archaeologists found a particular type of stone anchor used nowhere else in ancient India, suggesting Dwarka sailors adapted specifically for these treacherous waters. The city wasn't just spiritual. It was a working port fighting constant erosion. Maybe that's why its destruction became legendary. They'd battled the ocean for generations before finally losing. Marine archaeologists mapped over 150 square miles of ruins, revealing multiple settlement layers. The oldest date back nearly 3,500 years. Showing this spot was important long before the city from Hindu texts. Some structures exhibit fire damage, confirming written accounts of attacks before the flooding finished the job. It's rare for archaeology to align so neatly with mythology, which makes scientists suspicious. The Indian government heavily promotes Dwarka as Krishna's city, leading some to question if researchers are seeing what they want to see in those stones. Dwarka forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how legends form. When divers pulled up that first carved stone in 1983, did they find Krishna's city or create it? The ruins are real enough, but connecting them to specific events and sacred texts requires leaps of faith. Maybe that's why the site fascinates Atlantis hunters. It's the closest thing we've got to finding a lost city that matches its myth down to ruler's name and architectural details. Except unlike Atlantis, we know exactly where Dwarka is. It's just a question of whether the stories about it are history or holy text. The Arabian Sea continues eating away at the ruins. Strong currents shift sediments annually, sometimes revealing new artifacts, sometimes burying them deeper. Fishing trawlers drag nets across the site, accidentally hauling up ancient pottery shards with their catches. One diver described swimming through the sunken streets during low visibility, his hands tracing stone walls as fish darted between what might have been market stalls or temples. Whether it's Krishna's city or not, Dwarka proves one thing: the ocean takes centuries to erase us completely, but it never forgets where we built. Asterisk. The reason Atlantis won't die isn't because of Plato's writing skills, it's because the story scratches 3 primal itches we can't stop scratching. First, where did we come from? Civilizations love origin stories, especially ones involving forgotten golden ages.
Hacking.
Would I before my rely? Would I buy burger? I my burger and grab my The idea that hubris destroys greatness makes our own civilization's flaws easier to stomach. Third, what's hiding beneath the waves? The ocean keeps 80% of itself secret, despite all our submarines and satellites. That unknown fuels more fantasies than Atlantis' alleged architects ever could. Every generation remakes Atlantis in its own image. Victorians pictured it as steam-powered empire builders. Nazis imagined blonde supermen with death rays. New Agers see crystal-wielding hippies. The myth survives because it's a blank canvas. You can project anything onto it. Our current climate crisis makes Atlantis especially appealing now. A technologically advanced society, obliterated by natural forces, that hits different when your city streets flood annually. Plato warned about moral decay, but modern readings focus on environmental collapse instead. But the story bends without. Breaking no theory solves every piece of the puzzle, because Plato never meant it to be solved. His Atlantis had inconsistent sizes, impossible timelines, and supernatural destruction. But ambiguity is the myth's greatest strength. If someone found definitive ruins tomorrow, half the magic would vanish. The Newfoundland fishing captain who claims his sonar detected pyramids enjoys more fame than academics who proved it. Santorini inspired the tale. We love the hunt more than the catch. Just ask anyone who's wasted weekends searching for El Dorado or Bigfoot. The search itself reshapes how we see history. 19th century Atlantologists invented diffusionism, the bogus idea that all cultures descended from one superior source. Their research justified colonialism by portraying non-Europeans as degenerated Atlantean refugees. Later, Nazi mystics twisted the myth to prove Aryan supremacy. Even today, the conspiracy crowd uses Atlantis to argue against mainstream archaeology. One YouTuber's shaky footage of submerged columns gets more clicks than decades of peer-reviewed Minoan studies. Myths don't just reflect beliefs, they create them. Science occasionally benefits from the wild goose chase. Oceanography advanced partly because people kept dragging sonar across seabeds hunting for Plato's rings. The Richat structure's geology got documented in obsessive detail thanks to Atlantis truthers. Archaeologists revisiting Dwarka found actual submerged cities, just not the one they expected. The myth acts like cosmic bait, luring researchers into places they'd otherwise ignore. Sometimes they discover real things while chasing imaginary ones at its core. Atlantis endures because it's two stories in one. For skeptics, it's a lesson about how civilizations actually falls, lowly, through environmental mismanagement and institutional rot. For believers, it's a promise that greatness existed before us and could return. Both versions serve a purpose. The first keeps us humble. The second keeps us curious. The same person might scoff at Atlantean energy crystals while secretly hoping someone finds something inexplicable under the ice. Pop culture keeps repackaging the legend because its structure is bulletproof. Take any disaster movie and replace asteroid or virus with sunken civilization, the plot still works. Modern Atlantis stories just swap out the moral. Where Plato warned against invading armies, blockbusters warn about AI or genetic engineering. The details update, but the arc stays timeless. Ambition, achievement, catastrophic oversight. Screenwriters love it because audiences already know the beats. What's telling is how few cultures have an Atlantis equivalent. The flood myth appears globally, but complex pre-civilizations punish for their sophistication. That's oddly specific. Maybe Greece's volatile geography, earthquakes, volcanoes, sudden landslides made the idea resonate. Western obsession with decline narratives from Rome's fall to dystopian sci-fi. Either way, we've kept resuscitating Plato's parable for millennia while ignoring simpler stories from the same era. The myth's real power lies in its unfinished quality. Plato deliberately left holes, no coordinates, contradictory timelines. Zeus's interrupted speech. Our brains despise voids, so we keep stuffing them with theories. The Bronze Age collapse, sea level rises, comet impacts all get drafted as explanations. But the moment one theory gains traction, another rises to challenge it. Atlantis persists because we refuse to let it be solved. Some mysteries taste better unsolved. Walk any beach at low tide and you'll see it. That moment when water recedes just enough to hint at hidden shapes below. For a second, Your brain insists those shadows are ruins, not rocks. That's Atlantis in a nutshell. Not a place, but the tantalizing gap between what we see and what we wish were there. Plato would probably laugh at all the fuss. Then again, he's the one who baited the hook. Now we're stuck biting forever. Speaking of being stuck, ever notice how your phone mysteriously dies when you're about to film something weird? Yeah, that's another story. Asterisk, after 2,400 years, you've turned up 0 Atlantises, but we found something better. Real drowned cities like Dorca, actual disasters like Santorini's eruption. Plato's fiction led us to fact. The guy would probably laugh that we're still debating his bedtime story while Athens lies in ruins. The legend works because it's not really about Atlantis. It's about why civilizations fail and where knowledge goes when societies collapse. That's why we'll keep hunting not for rings in the ocean, but for warnings about our own fate. Misplace your civilization lately? Tell me in the comments. Keys and phones don't count. Asterisk. Thanks for watching, friends. If you enjoyed this dive into the mystery of Atlantis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories from Forgotten Scrolls. See you in the next adventure.